Sometimes the hardest choices we make in life leave scars that never fully heal. At 72, Harold Brennan carries the weight of giving up his daughter for adoption 35 years ago, a decision that haunts his quiet days on the Nebraska farm. His only real companion now is Clementine, an old barn cat who listens to his stories without judgment. When Harold notices a small lump on her side, he thinks it's just age catching up with them both. But a routine trip to the veterinarian changes everything. Dr. Sarah Mitchell discovers something unexpected under Clementine's skin, a microchip that connects to Harold's buried past. The trail leads to a shocking truth. The caring woman who's been treating his animals might be the daughter he lost all those years ago. Could a simple cat have carried the key to healing a broken family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nebraska farmland as Harold Brennan stepped onto his weathered front porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his calloused hands. At 72, his joints protested the early hour, but routine was the backbone of his existence. The same ritual every day for the past decade, since Martha passed. Coffee first, then a survey of his modest kingdom. "Morning, Clementine," he called softly to the orange tabby cat stretched across the porch railing. She opened one amber eye, acknowledged him with a slow blink, then returned to her morning contemplation of the surrounding fields. Harold's farm wasn't much to look at by modern standards. The paint on the barn had faded to a rustic grey, and the farmhouse itself showed its age in every creaking floorboard and settling beam. But it was his, paid off with decades of hard work and careful living. The 160 acres had been in his family since his grandfather's time, though Harold had long since leased out most of the cropland to younger neighbours with more energy and modern equipment. He kept a small vegetable garden and tended to a handful of chickens, more for the comfort of routine than any real necessity. His needs were simple now, simpler than they'd ever been when Martha was alive, and they dreamed of filling the house with children's laughter. The gold wedding band he wore on a thin chain around his neck caught the morning light as he bent to stroke Clementine's fur. Martha had given it to him on their 10th anniversary, insisting he wear it close to his heart when arthritis made wearing it on his finger too painful. Even now, 3 years after her funeral, he couldn't bring himself to remove it. Some promises, he believed, extended beyond the grave. "What do you think, old girl? Should we check on those tomatoes today?" Harold asked, his voice carrying the gentle tone he reserved for his feline companion. Clementine had appeared on his doorstep 6 years ago, a scrawny stray with matted fur and suspicious eyes. Martha had insisted they take her in, despite Harold's grumbling about vet bills they couldn't afford. Now, the cat was his primary confidant, listening patiently to his daily observations about weather, neighbors, and the persistent ache of loneliness that settled deeper into his bones each passing year. She never judged him for talking to himself, never grew tired of his stories, and never asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. As Harold made his way toward the garden, Clementine followed with the dignified pace of a creature who had long ago decided this human was worth her attention. The morning was pleasantly cool for late September, with the kind of crisp air that promised a beautiful autumn ahead. Harold had always loved this season, the satisfaction of harvest time, even if his harvest now consisted mainly of tomatoes and green beans. He was pulling weeds from between the pepper plants when his daughter Rebecca's silver sedan turned up the gravel drive. Harold straightened slowly, brushing dirt from his knees as he watched her park near the house. Rebecca visited every few weeks, though Harold suspected duty motivated her more than genuine affection. Their relationship had been strained since Martha's death, when grief had made him even more withdrawn than usual. "Morning, Dad," Rebecca called as she approached, her heels clicking carefully on the uneven ground. At 45, she still dressed like the insurance adjuster she'd been before marriage and children. Even on weekends, she favored pressed slacks and modest blazers, as if casual clothes might somehow diminish her authority. "Didn't expect you today," Harold said, not unkindly but without enthusiasm. He'd learned to be wary of unexpected visits. They usually meant Rebecca had decided he needed something. Help with repairs, suggestions about his health, or increasingly frequent conversations about whether he should consider assisted living options. "I was in the area and thought I'd check on you." She glanced around the garden with the critical eye of someone who saw maintenance issues rather than personal accomplishment. "The gutters need cleaning again," Harold nodded noncommittally. "I'll get to them." "Dad, you can't be climbing ladders at your age. What if you fell? What if—" Rebecca caught herself before launching into her familiar litany of concerns. Instead, she softened her tone. "I worry about you out here alone." "I'm not alone." Harold gestured toward Clementine, who had claimed a sunny patch near the tomato stakes. "Got my supervisor here keeping an eye on things." Rebecca followed his gaze and frowned slightly. "She looks like she's gained weight." Harold looked more closely at his cat. Clementine did seem a bit rounder than usual, though he'd attributed it to the lazy contentment of a well-fed barn cat. But now, studying her profile as she stretched in the sunlight, he noticed something else. A small bump along her left side, just behind her front leg. "Huh," he murmured, kneeling beside Clementine and gently running his fingers over the area. The lump was about the size of a marble, firm but not hard, and Clementine didn't seem bothered by his examination. "Never noticed that before." Rebecca stepped closer, her insurance training making her naturally alert to potential problems. "What is it?" "Probably nothing. Old cats get lumps sometimes. Could be a fatty tumor, maybe scar tissue from when she was still running wild." Harold continued his gentle exploration, finding no other unusual bumps or sensitive spots. "She's not acting sick. Dad, you need to take her to a vet." Harold's expression tightened. "For a little bump? That had cost more than I spend on groceries in a month." "It could be serious. It could be nothing," Harold interrupted, his voice carrying the edge it always took when money became the topic. He'd been poor once, truly poor, and the memory of choosing between necessities still influenced every financial decision. "She's eating fine, sleeping normal. No point spending money we don't have to." Rebecca studied her father's face, recognizing the stubborn set of his jaw that had frustrated her since childhood. He'd been the same way about his own health issues, putting off doctor visits until problems became undeniable. After Martha's death, this tendency had only grown worse. "What if I paid for it?" she offered, "just to be safe." Harold's pride bristled. "I don't need charity from my own daughter." "It's not charity, Dad. It's peace of mind. For both of us." They stood in uncomfortable silence, the morning's pleasant warmth suddenly feeling oppressive. Harold had always struggled with accepting help, even from family. It felt too much like admitting defeat, acknowledging that he couldn't manage on his own anymore. Clementine, seemingly oblivious to the tension her discovery had created, rose and rubbed against Harold's legs with a rumbling purr. The simple gesture of affection broke through his defensiveness like it always did. "Maybe next week," he conceded, "if it gets bigger or she starts acting off." Rebecca recognized this was likely the best compromise she'd get. "There's a new vet in town, Dr. Mitchell. I've heard good things about her." Harold nodded absently, already turning back toward his garden. But as Rebecca drove away an hour later, he found himself frequently glancing at Clementine, noting the way she moved, watching for any sign of discomfort or illness. The lump seemed so innocent, so harmless, yet its discovery had stirred an uneasiness in him that he couldn't quite name. That evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the sun set over his fields, Clementine curled up on his lap, as she did every night. He stroked her fur with the gentle rhythm of long practice, his fingers occasionally finding that mysterious bump. Each time he touched it, a strange chill ran through him. Not fear for Clementine's health, exactly, but something deeper and less definable. It was as if that small lump had somehow disturbed the careful equilibrium of his quiet life, like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their apparent cause. Harold had spent years constructing a world of predictable routines and manageable responsibilities. He'd buried his regrets deep enough that they rarely troubled his daily existence. But tonight, sitting with his cat in the gathering darkness, Harold felt the uncomfortable stirring of old anxieties, old guilts that he'd thought were finally laid to rest. He couldn't have explained why a simple veterinary visit felt like opening a door he'd spent decades keeping locked. He only knew that some instinct, some deeply buried awareness, was whispering warnings he didn't want to hear, just a little. "Bump," he murmured to Clementine, as much to reassure himself as her. Nothing more than that. But even as he spoke the words, Harold suspected he was wrong. 3 days later, Harold was replacing a loose board on his front steps when Rebecca's car pulled up the drive again. This time, she wasn't alone. Her husband Tom emerged from the passenger seat, and their teenage son Jake climbed out of the back, already absorbed in his phone. "Dad," Rebecca called, her voice carrying a determined edge that Harold recognized as trouble. "We need to talk." Harold set down his hammer and straightened slowly, his back protesting the morning's work. "About what?" "About Clementine." Rebecca approached with the measured steps of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I've been thinking about that lump, and I called Dr. Mitchell's office. They can see her this afternoon." "I told you. I made the appointment," Rebecca interrupted. "And I'm paying for it. No arguments." Harold's jaw tightened. "You had no right to—" "Dad, look at her." Harold turned to where Clementine lay, sprawled in her favorite sunny spot. To his eyes, she looked exactly the same as always, content, peaceful, thoroughly untroubled by human concerns. But something in Rebecca's tone made him look closer. "She's been sleeping more," Rebecca continued. "When I was here Sunday, she barely got up to greet me. That's not like her." Tom stepped forward. His presence meant to provide backup for his wife's argument. "Harold, it's just a checkup. Better safe than sorry." Harold felt cornered, pressured by their united front. His instinct was to dig in, to assert his authority over his own cat and his own decisions. But as he watched Clementine, he realized Rebecca might be right. The cat did seem more lethargic lately, though he'd attributed it to the natural laziness of a well-fed house cat. "Fine," he said finally. "But I'm driving myself. Dad. My cat, my truck, my choice." Harold's voice carried a finality that Rebecca knew better than to challenge. The Mitchell Veterinary Clinic occupied a converted house on the outskirts of town, its white siding and blue trim giving it a welcoming residential feel. Harold parked his ancient pickup between a gleaming SUV and a hybrid sedan, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the rust spots and faded paint that marked his vehicle as belonging to an earlier era. Clementine rode in her carrier with the resigned dignity of a creature who'd learned to endure necessary indignities. She'd been surprisingly cooperative about getting into the carrier, another small sign that perhaps Rebecca's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and pet shampoo, with walls covered in cheerful posters about heartworm prevention and dental care. Harold took a seat in the corner, Clementine's carrier on his lap, and tried to ignore the curious glances from other pet owners. He felt out of place among the younger families with their designer pet accessories and casual familiarity with veterinary procedures. Mr. Brennan, a young woman in scrubs, appeared from the back office. "Dr. Mitchell will see you now." Harold followed her down a short hallway lined with examination rooms. The woman, her name tag read Jessica, led him into the second room and gestured toward the stainless steel examination table. "You can let Clementine out of the carrier," Jessica said. "Dr. Mitchell will be right with you." Harold opened the carrier door, and Clementine emerged with cautious steps, immediately beginning to explore this new environment. The room was clean and bright, with medical equipment Harold didn't recognize, and charts showing the anatomy of various animals. A soft knock preceded the entrance of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and Harold's first thought was how young she looked. At what he guessed was around 35, she had an easy confidence that spoke of someone comfortable with her expertise. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held the kind of warmth that immediately put nervous pet owners at ease. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Dr. Mitchell." She extended her hand with a genuine smile. "And this must be Clementine." Harold shook her hand, noting the firm grip and calloused fingers that spoke of hands-on work. "Rebecca, my daughter. She insisted we come in. Always good to be cautious with our senior cats." Dr. Mitchell approached Clementine slowly, letting the cat sniff her hand before attempting any examination. "How old is Clementine?" "Not sure exactly. She showed up about 6 years ago as a stray. I guess she's maybe 10 or 11 now." Dr. Mitchell nodded, beginning her examination with gentle, practiced movements. She checked Clementine's eyes, ears, and teeth, listening to her heart and lungs with a stethoscope. Throughout the process, she maintained a running commentary that was clearly intended to put both Harold and Clementine at ease. "Her heart sounds good, nice and strong. Eyes are clear, no signs of infection. Now I understand there's a lump we're concerned about." Harold pointed to the area behind Clementine's front leg. "Right there. It's about the size of a marble, maybe a little smaller." Dr. Mitchell's fingers found the lump immediately, her touch gentle but thorough. She spent several minutes palpating the area, her expression neutral but focused. Harold found himself studying her face for any sign of concern, any hint about what she might be thinking. "It's well defined," she murmured, more to herself than to Harold. "Not attached to underlying structures. Could be a lipoma, could be—" She paused, frowning slightly. "Actually, this feels a bit unusual. Mr. Brennan, do you mind if I try something?" "What kind of something?" "I'd like to use our scanner to see if there might be a microchip in this area. Sometimes lumps can form around foreign objects, and if Clementine was someone's pet before she came to you, she might have been chipped." Harold felt a strange chill run down his spine. "A microchip? It's very common now. Many pet owners have their animals microchipped for identification purposes. The chip is about the size of a grain of rice, and sometimes tissue can build up around it, creating what feels like a lump." Dr. Mitchell disappeared for a moment and returned with a small, handheld device that looked like a price scanner from a grocery store. She ran it slowly over the lump, watching a small digital display. The device emitted a sharp beep. "There we go," Dr. Mitchell said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "There's definitely a microchip here. That explains the lump. Just a little tissue reaction, nothing dangerous at all." Harold should have felt relieved. Instead, the chill in his spine intensified. "What does the chip tell you?" Dr. Mitchell was already connecting the scanner to her computer. "Each chip has a unique number that's registered in a database. If we're lucky, we might be able to find out who Clementine's original owners were. Sometimes people like to know their lost pets ended up in good homes." The computer screen filled with information as Dr. Mitchell entered the chip's serial number. Harold found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't have said why. "Interesting," Dr. Mitchell said, studying the screen. "The chip is registered to a family named Thompson. Address shows as Rural Route 7, which isn't far from your place. Actually, the registration is from about 8 years ago." Thompson. The name hit Harold like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Thompson was a name he'd tried to forget for 35 years, a name associated with the most painful chapter of his life. "Mr. Brennan, are you all right? You look a little pale." Harold forced himself to focus on Dr. Mitchell's concerned face. That's interesting. Wonder how she ended up at my place." Cats can travel surprising distances, especially if they're looking for food or shelter. "The Thompsons might be happy to know what happened to her, if you'd like me to reach out to them." "No," Harold said quickly, then caught himself. "I mean, no need to bother them. Clementine's been happy with me. No point stirring up old situations." "Doctor." Mitchell nodded, though Harold caught a flicker of curiosity in her expression. "Of course, That's entirely your decision. The important thing is that the lump is nothing to worry about. Just keep an eye on it, and if it changes size or Clementine seems uncomfortable, bring her back in. Harold managed to get through the rest of the appointment, paying the bill and accepting Dr. Mitchell's business card with hands that he hoped weren't visibly shaking. But as he drove home with Clementine secure in her carrier, his mind was spinning with implications he didn't want to consider. Thompson. After all these years, that name had somehow found its way back into his life through the most innocent possible means. Harold tried to tell himself it was coincidence, that there were probably dozens of Thompson families in the county. But deep in his gut, where instinct lived stronger than logic, he knew better. The past, it seemed, had just knocked on his door in the form of a microchip embedded in his cat's skin. And Harold wasn't sure he was ready for whatever truths that chip might ultimately reveal. Harold returned to his farm, with his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and his mind churning with memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. The name Thompson echoed in his thoughts like a bell that couldn't be unrung, carrying with it the weight of choices that had shaped his entire life. Clementine seemed unbothered by the veterinary visit, settling immediately into her afternoon nap spot on the living room sofa. Harold envied her ability to simply exist in the present moment, unmarked by regrets or the complicated weight of human decisions. He moved through his evening routine mechanically, feeding the chickens, checking the garden, preparing a simple dinner of leftover soup and crackers. But beneath the familiar actions, his mind kept drifting back to 1989, to a time when he was 37 years old and drowning in circumstances beyond his control. That night, unable to sleep, Harold found himself standing in his home office, a small room that had once been intended as a nursery when he and Martha first married. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he now used it to store farm records and tax documents, the mundane paperwork of a life that had turned out so differently than planned. He opened the bottom drawer of his old wooden desk, pushing aside folders of receipts and insurance papers until his fingers found what he was looking for, a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive power. The envelope was unmarked, except for his own handwriting. CB, 1989. Harold had looked at this envelope exactly 3 times in 35 years. Once when he'd first sealed it, once on the 5th anniversary of the adoption, when grief and guilt had overwhelmed him during a particularly difficult winter, and once more after Martha's funeral, when he'd briefly considered destroying it entirely. Now, sitting at his desk, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the nighttime silence, he carefully opened the envelope and spread its contents across the desktop. There wasn't much, just a few official documents, a hospital bracelet, and a single photograph. The adoption papers were typed on legal letterheads, full of formal language that had reduced the most emotionally devastating decision of his life to a series of signatures and witness statements. Harold's eyes skipped over most of the text, focusing on the details he'd memorized long ago: the adoptive family's name, Thompson, the date, March 15, 1989, and the clinical description of the child, female infant, healthy, 6 lbs 2 Oz. The hospital bracelet was tiny, designed for a newborn's wrist. It read, "Baby girl Brennan," in faded blue ink, the only physical proof that his daughter had ever carried his name, even for those brief 3 days before the adoption was finalized. But it was the photograph that drew Harold's attention, as it always did. The picture showed his first wife, Carol, holding their newborn daughter in the hospital room. Carol looked exhausted but beautiful, her dark hair falling around her shoulders as she gazed down at the baby with an expression of pure love mixed with devastating sadness. Harold had taken the photo himself, using an old Polaroid camera, never imagining it would become the only visual record he'd have of his first family. Carol had insisted on the picture, saying she wanted to remember this moment before they had to say goodbye forever. Looking at it now, Harold was struck by how much the baby in the photo resembled Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the chin, features that could easily be explained by coincidence, but felt too specific to dismiss. He'd noticed something familiar about Dr. Mitchell during their appointment, a nagging sense of recognition that he'd attributed to small-town familiarity. Now he wondered if it was something deeper. The memories came flooding back despite his efforts to hold them at bay. Harold had been young when he married Carol, barely 22 and full of dreams about farming the land his family had worked for generations. Carol had been even younger, just 19, with aspirations of teaching school and raising children in the small Nebraska community where they'd both grown up. For the first few years, those dreams had seemed achievable. Harold worked the farm with the energy of youth, growing corn and soybeans, raising cattle, building what he hoped would be a legacy for the children they planned to have. But farming, especially for small operators, was a precarious business. Bad weather, fluctuating commodity prices and equipment failures could devastate a year's income in a matter of weeks. By 1988, Harold was drowning in debt. The farm that had been in his family for 3 generations was mortgaged to the hilt, and creditors were calling daily. He'd already sold most of the cattle and was contemplating bankruptcy when Carol announced she was pregnant. The pregnancy should have been a blessing, but given their financial situation, it felt more like a crisis. Harold was working 18-hour days trying to keep the farm afloat, taking odd jobs in town when he wasn't needed in the fields. Carol had been forced to quit her part-time job at the local grocery store when morning sickness made it impossible for her to work. They had no health insurance. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away, and as Carol's pregnancy progressed, it became clear that they were facing costs they simply couldn't manage. The baby would be born into poverty, into a situation where Harold couldn't even guarantee he'd be able to keep a roof over their heads. The suggestion came from Carol's doctor, delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that made it sound reasonable rather than heartbreaking. There were families, he explained, good families with resources and stability, who desperately wanted children. The adoption process could cover all medical expenses and ensure the baby had opportunities that Harold and Carol simply couldn't provide. Harold had wanted to refuse, had wanted to insist they'd find a way to make it work. But the numbers were merciless. They owed more than the farm was worth, their credit was destroyed, and winter was coming with heating bills they couldn't pay. What kind of father would he be if he condemned his child to that kind of uncertainty? The Thompsons had been presented as the perfect solution. An older couple established in their careers, unable to have children of their own, but desperate to love and raise a family. They lived in town, had a stable income, and could provide everything Harold and Carol couldn't: security, education, opportunities. The meeting had taken place in the lawyer's office, formal and awkward, with the Thompsons trying to be respectful of Harold and Carol's grief, while clearly eager to finalize the arrangements. Mrs. Thompson had been particularly kind, promising to love the baby as their own and expressing gratitude for the gift Harold and Carol were giving them. Harold closed his eyes, remembering the weight of his daughter in his arms during those 3 precious days in the hospital. She had been perfect, absolutely perfect, with tiny fingers that would curl around his thumb and dark eyes that seemed to look right through him. He'd tried to memorize every detail, the sound of her breathing, the way she fit perfectly in the crook of his elbow, the impossible softness of her skin. Signing the papers had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, harder even than burying Carol 2 months later, when her grief and guilt had led her to take dangerous risks on icy roads. Now, 35 years later, Harold wondered if that perfect baby had grown up to become Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the kind and competent woman who'd treated his cat with such gentle care. The timing was right, the location was right, and those nagging familiarities suddenly made sense. But wondering and knowing were 2 different things, and Harold wasn't sure he was ready for the truth. Harold slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with fragments of memories and what-if scenarios that left him exhausted by dawn. He went through his morning routine like a man underwater, every movement deliberate but disconnected from conscious thought. Even Clementine seemed to sense his distraction, following him more closely than usual and offering the occasional headbutt against his legs in her version of comfort. He was attempting to focus on repairing a section of fence when the phone rang. Harold rarely received calls before noon, and the unexpected sound made him start. "Mr. Brennan, this is Dr. Mitchell from the veterinary clinic." Harold's pulse quickened. "Is something wrong with the test results?" "Oh no, nothing like that. Clementine is perfectly healthy. I'm actually calling about the microchip information. I did a bit more research, and I have some additional details about the Thompson family, if you're interested." Harold gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of details?" "Well, it turns out the chip registration shows it was originally placed when the cat was quite young, probably around 2 years old. The interesting thing is that the contact information hasn't been updated in several years. And when I tried calling the number on file, it was disconnected." Harold felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. If the Thompsons had moved or changed numbers, it might mean this particular connection to his past was a dead end after all. "However," Dr. Mitchell continued, "I did some checking with other local veterinarians, and it seems the Thompson family was well known in this area. Richard and Margaret Thompson, they lived on Route 7 for many years before retiring to Florida. About 5 years ago, the names hit Harold like physical blows. Richard and Margaret Thompson. He remembered them now, remembered Margaret's gentle voice and Richard's formal handshake in the lawyer's office all those years ago. His legs felt unsteady, and he sank into the nearest chair. "Mr. Brennan, are you still there?" "Yes, that's interesting information." "That's interesting. The reason I'm calling is that I was adopted myself, and I know how meaningful it can be when pets from your past find their way into your life. Sometimes these little connections can be quite special, even when we don't fully understand them." Harold almost laughed at the irony. Dr. Mitchell was talking about meaningful connections, without realizing she might be describing the most meaningful connection of his entire life. "Dr. Mitchell," he said carefully, "can I ask, when you say you were adopted, was that locally?" "Yes, right here in the county. I've actually been curious about my biological family for years, though I've always respected my parents' privacy. About the details. The Thompsons were wonderful parents. I couldn't have asked for better. But you know how it is. There's always that wondering about where you came from." Harold's heart hammered against his ribs. "The Thompsons adopted you." Pause. "Yes, that's right. Richard and Margaret Thompson are my parents. Well, adoptive parents, obviously. Why do you ask?" Harold closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 35 years of secrets pressing down on him. This was the moment he'd both dreaded and longed. For since signing those papers in 1989, his daughter, was on the other end of this phone call, not knowing she was talking to the father who'd given her away. That's quite a coincidence," he managed. "Small world, I suppose." "It really is. Anyway, I thought you'd want to know that Clementine probably spent her early years with my family. She likely wandered off when she got older. Cats do. That sometimes, especially if they're not strictly indoor cats. The Thompsons lived fairly close to your property, so it makes sense she'd end up in your area." Harold tried to process this information rationally. Clementine had been his daughter's cat, part of her childhood, part of the family that had raised her, and now, by some impossible stroke of fate, that same cat had brought them together again. "Dr. Mitchell, Sarah," he said, then caught himself. Using her first name felt too intimate, too presumptuous for their professional relationship. "Please, call me Sarah. And I hope you don't mind me asking, but you seem quite interested in the Thompson connection. Did you know them?" Harold's mind raced. This was his opportunity to reveal the truth, to explain the connection that ran deeper than anyone could imagine. But the words stuck in his throat. What would he say? How do you tell someone that you're... The father who gave them away before they could even form memories? I may have known them in passing, he said finally, small community and all. Of course. Well, the important thing is that Clementine found a good home with you. My parents always said she was a wonderful cat, very affectionate, great with children. They were heartbroken when she went missing. Harold thought about Clementine's behavior over the past 6 years, her immediate acceptance of his household, her intuitive understanding of his moods and needs. Had she somehow recognized something in him? Some genetic connection that transcended rational explanation? Mr. Brennan, I hope this doesn't sound too forward, but would you be interested in meeting for coffee sometime? I'd love to hear more about how Clementine has been doing, and I have some old photos of her as a kitten that you might enjoy seeing. The invitation caught Harold completely off guard. Coffee with his daughter who didn't know she was his daughter. The situation was simultaneously everything he'd ever hoped for, and more complicated than he could handle. That's very kind of you, he said slowly. I know it might seem odd, but since my parents moved to Florida, I've been feeling a bit disconnected from those childhood memories. Seeing Clementine again, even just hearing about her, brings back some really happy times. Harold found himself thinking about Martha's old recipe box, sitting in their kitchen cabinet, filled with index cards, covered in her careful handwriting. Many of the recipes were for dishes they'd planned to make for the children they'd hoped to have together. Harold had never told Martha about his first daughter, had never shared the guilt and loss that shadowed his heart even during their happiest moments. Martha had written notes on some of those recipe cards, little observations about wanting to teach their future children to bake, hopes about family traditions they'd create together. She'd never known that Harold already had a daughter somewhere in the world, a child who might have grown up loving the same chocolate chip cookies or Sunday pot roasts that Martha had dreamed of sharing. Mr. Brennan. Harold realized he'd been silent too long. Yes, coffee sounds nice. When were you thinking? How about Saturday morning? There's a nice little place on Main Street, Maggie's Cafe. Do you know it? I do. Harold had eaten there exactly twice in the past decade, both times when Rebecca had insisted on taking him out for his birthday. Wonderful. Shall we say 10 o'clock? After Harold hung up, he sat in his kitchen staring at Martha's recipe box and wondering what she would have thought about this impossible situation. Would she have been happy that he might have a chance to reconnect with his lost daughter? Would she have understood why he'd kept such a fundamental secret from her throughout their marriage? Outside, Clementine appeared at the kitchen window, her amber eyes fixed on Harold with that unblinking stare cats perfected long ago. For the first time since she'd appeared on his doorstep, Harold wondered if her arrival had been less about finding a home and more about fulfilling some deeper purpose, bringing a father and daughter together after 35 years of separation. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly, matching Harold's conflicted mood as he prepared for his coffee meeting with Sarah. He'd changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on his cleanest pair of khakis and a button-down shirt that Martha had bought him years ago for church services he rarely attended anymore. Looking at himself in the bedroom mirror, he saw an old man trying too hard to make a good impression on a daughter who didn't know she was meeting her father. Maggie's Cafe occupied a corner building on Main Street, its red checkered curtains and hand-painted sign giving it the kind of homey charm that attracted both locals and the occasional tourist passing through on their way to somewhere more interesting. Harold arrived 10 minutes early, a habit ingrained from decades of farm scheduling, and chose a corner booth where he could watch the door. Sarah arrived precisely at 10, shaking raindrops from her jacket as she scanned the cafe's interior. Harold raised his hand in a small wave, and her face lit up with recognition and what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Just got here myself," Harold lied, studying her face in the better lighting of the cafe. The resemblance to Carol was even more striking than he'd remembered, Something about the way she tilted her head when listening, the quick expressiveness of her hands when she spoke. They ordered coffee and settled into the kind of polite conversation that strangers use to find common ground. Sarah talked about her veterinary practice, mentioning that she'd taken over the clinic from the previous owner just 2 years ago. Harold shared carefully edited stories about his farming days, leaving out the financial struggles and personal tragedies that had defined those years. "I brought those photos I mentioned," Sarah said, pulling a small album from her purse. "These are from when Clementine was younger, though she went by Ginger back then." Harold accepted the album with hands that trembled slightly. The first few pages showed a much smaller version of Clementine, playing with toys, sleeping in sunny patches, and interacting with the Thompson family. But it was the photos of Sarah herself that took Harold's breath away. There she was, as a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, holding Clementine in her arms with a grin that revealed missing front teeth. Another photo showed her at what looked like a high school graduation. Clementine, now visibly older, but still clearly devoted to the young woman who'd raised her. "She really was part of the family," Sarah said, watching Harold's face as he studied the pictures. "My parents got her when I was about 10. I'd been begging for a pet for years, and they finally gave in. Clementine, Ginger, was supposed to be an outdoor barn cat, but she had other ideas." Harold found his voice. "She looks like she was a good companion. The best. She used to sleep on my bed every night, even though my parents tried to enforce a no cats in the bedrooms rule. She'd wait until everyone was asleep, then sneak in and curl up by my feet. I always pretended to be surprised to find her there. In the morning, the image of Sarah as a child, comforted by the same cat who now provided Harold with companionship, created an unexpected bridge between their separate lives. Clementine had been witness to Sarah's growing up, had provided the same intuitive affection and understanding that Harold now cherished. "Mr. Brennan, can I ask you something that might seem a bit personal?" Harold tensed. "Of course. When you brought Clementine in the other day, you seemed very familiar to me. I kept thinking I'd seen you before, but I couldn't place where. Did we maybe meet when you were visiting the Thompsons?" Harold's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as he set it down. "I don't think so. I didn't know your parents well." Sarah frowned slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "It's the strangest thing. There's something about your voice, or maybe the way you hold yourself. My mother always said I had a good memory for faces, but this feels different. Like déjà vu, but stronger." The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, and Harold felt the familiar urge to retreat, to deflect with the kind of non-committal responses that had served him well for decades. But looking at Sarah's open, curious face, he found himself wanting to tell her everything, about Carol, about the desperate circumstances that led to the adoption, about the 35 years he'd wondered about her welfare and happiness. Instead, he asked, "Were you happy with the Thompsons? Growing up, I mean." Sarah's expression softened. "Very happy. They were wonderful parents, patient, loving, always supportive of whatever I wanted to try. Dad taught me to fish and helped me build a treehouse. Mom taught me to cook and garden. They never made me feel like I was anything other than their chosen daughter." "Did you ever wonder about your biological parents?" "Sometimes, especially when I was younger, but my parents were always honest about the adoption. They told me that my birth parents were very young and couldn't provide for a child, but that they'd chosen the Thompsons because they wanted me to have the best possible life." Harold felt a stab of gratitude toward Richard and Margaret Thompson for framing the adoption in such generous terms. They could have painted him and Carol as irresponsible or uncaring, but they'd chosen to emphasize love and sacrifice instead. "They said my birth parents were from around here," Sarah continued. "Local people who were facing hard times. I've always respected their privacy, figured if they wanted contact, they'd have found a way. But I'll admit, I've always been curious about the medical history, genetic predispositions, that sort of thing." Harold realized this was his opening, his chance to provide the information Sarah might need while still maintaining some distance. "What would you want to know?" "Oh, the usual. Family health history, genetic conditions, ethnic background. As a veterinarian, I'm very aware of how genetics influence health outcomes. I'd love to know if there are things I should be watching for as I get older." Harold could answer those questions. He could tell her about Carol's strong heart and quick mind, about his own family's tendency toward arthritis, but general longevity. He could share the medical history that might help her make informed decisions about her own health care, but providing that information would require explaining how he possessed such detailed knowledge about her biological parents. And that explanation would inevitably lead to truths Harold still wasn't sure either of them was ready to face. "I suppose that would be valuable information to have," he said carefully. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Brennan, I hope you don't think I'm being presumptuous, but there's something about this conversation that feels important. I can't explain it, but it's like we're dancing around something significant." Harold met her eyes, seeing intelligence and intuition that reminded him painfully of Carol. Sarah might not know the truth yet, but some part of her was sensing the deeper currents running beneath their polite conversation. "Sometimes," Harold said slowly, "life has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most." Sarah smiled, but her eyes remained thoughtful. "That's exactly how I felt when you walked into the clinic with Clementine, like it wasn't really a coincidence at all." The coffee meeting left Harold feeling more unsettled than before. He'd driven home, through the light rain, with Sarah's words echoing in his mind, her intuition that their meeting wasn't coincidental, her curiosity about her biological parents, and most troubling of all, her sense that they'd met before. The careful walls he'd built around his secret were beginning to crack under the pressure of proximity to the truth. That evening, Harold found himself in his bedroom, standing before the old dresser that had belonged to his parents and grandparents before him. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, swollen from years of Nebraska humidity, but he wrestled it open and reached toward the very back, behind folded quilts that still smelled faintly of Martha's lavender sachets. His fingers found what he was looking for, a small wooden box, no bigger than a jewelry case, that he'd hidden there shortly after Martha's funeral. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was the only photograph he'd kept from his first marriage, besides the one in the adoption papers. The picture showed Carol holding their daughter just hours after birth, before the Thompsons had arrived for their first meeting. Carol looked exhausted but radiant. Her dark hair spread across the hospital pillow as she gazed down at the baby with an expression of pure, devastating love. The infant's tiny fist was curled around Carol's finger, and even in the grainy Polaroid, Harold could see the delicate features that he now recognized in Sarah's adult face. Harold sank onto the edge of his bed, studying the photograph in the lamplight. 35 years had passed since that moment, but the emotions captured in the image felt as immediate as yesterday. Carol had insisted on this picture, wanting to remember what she called the only perfect moment of her life, those brief hours when she was simply a mother holding her child, before reality intruded with its harsh demands and impossible choices. A soft knock at his bedroom door interrupted his reverie. Harold quickly tucked the photograph back into its box and closed the drawer before calling out, "Come in." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Dad, I saw your light was still on. It's past midnight." Harold hadn't realized how long he'd been sitting there, lost in memories. "Couldn't sleep." Rebecca entered the room and perched on the edge of the bed beside him. "You've seemed different since Clementine's vet appointment. Distracted. Is something wrong?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Harold wasn't ready to address. How could he explain to Rebecca that she had a half-sister she'd never known existed? How could he reveal that he'd kept such a fundamental secret from their family for her entire life? "Just thinking about getting older," he said, which wasn't entirely untrue. "That vet visit made me realize how much responsibility I have to Clementine. What happens to her if something happens to me? Rebecca's expression softened. Dad, nothing's going to happen to you. You're healthier than most men 20 years younger. Still, it's worth thinking about. Planning ahead. If you're worried about Clementine, I'm sure we could work something out. The kids would love having her around more often. Harold nodded, though his concerns ran much deeper than pet care arrangements. The meeting with Sarah had opened emotional doors he'd thought were permanently sealed. For the first time in decades, he was allowing himself to imagine what it might be like to have a relationship with his daughter, to be part of her life in some small way. But that possibility came with enormous risks. Sarah was happy, successful, surrounded by people who loved her. What right did he have to disrupt that contentment with revelations about a past she'd never asked to revisit? And what about Rebecca? She'd grown up as his only child, secure in that identity and position. Learning about Sarah would fundamentally alter her understanding of their family history. Rebecca, Harold said carefully, what do you know about my first marriage? His daughter looked surprised by the question. Just what you've told me over the years, that you were married to Carol, that she died young in a car accident. Why? Did I ever mention that Carol and I... Harold stopped, unable to find the words. Dad, what's wrong? You're scaring me. Harold looked at his daughter's concerned face and felt the familiar weight of protective instincts. Rebecca had her own life, her own family, her own challenges. She didn't need the complications that would come with learning about Sarah. Nothing's wrong, he said finally. Just old memories stirred up by the vet visit, I suppose. Dr. Mitchell mentioned that Clementine's microchip was registered to a family named Thompson. The name was familiar, Rebecca frowned. Thompson? Should I know that name? No, it's nothing important, just got me thinking about the old days. Rebecca studied his face for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story than he was sharing. Dad, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? I mean, I know we don't always see eye to eye, but I care about you. If something's bothering you, I know, sweetheart, I appreciate that. Rebecca squeezed his shoulder before standing. Try to get some sleep, okay? And if you want to talk more about this Thompson situation, or about Mom, your first wife, I'm here. After Rebecca left, Harold returned to his dresser drawer and retrieved the photograph once more. In the soft lamplight, he could see so clearly how the baby in Carol's arms had grown into the compassionate woman who'd examined Clementine with such gentle expertise. Sarah had mentioned her curiosity about genetic medical history, and Harold realized he could provide that information easily enough. Carol's family had been generally healthy. No major hereditary diseases, good cardiovascular health, longevity on both sides. His own family tree was similarly robust, marked more by the kind of wear and tear that came from physical labor than by genetic predispositions. But sharing that information would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. How would he justify having such detailed knowledge about Sarah's biological parents unless he revealed his own connection to her story? Harold carefully returned the photograph to its hiding place and prepared for bed, knowing that sleep would likely elude him once again. The comfortable isolation he'd maintained for so many years was being systematically dismantled by a series of coincidences that felt increasingly like fate. Tomorrow, he would need to decide whether to pursue the fragile connection with Sarah or retreat back into the safety of secrets and separation. But tonight, as he lay in the darkness listening to the autumn wind rattling his windows, Harold allowed himself the dangerous luxury of imagining what it might feel like to tell his daughter the truth about who he was, and to finally, after 35 years of silence, hear her call him father. 3 days later, Harold was replacing a rotted fence post when he saw Sarah's truck turning up his driveway. His heart lurched with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They hadn't planned another meeting, and unexpected visits usually meant either very good news or very bad news. Sarah climbed out of her truck, carrying a manila folder and wearing the kind of serious expression that made Harold's stomach clench with worry. Clementine appeared from somewhere and rubbed against Sarah's legs in greeting, as if recognizing a familiar scent from her past. "Mr. Brennan, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," Sarah said, bending to scratch Clementine behind the ears. "I have some information I thought you'd want to hear, and I felt like it was too important for a phone call. Of course, would you like to come in? I could make some coffee. That would be nice." Harold led her into his kitchen, grateful that he'd washed the breakfast dishes and cleared away the farm paperwork that usually cluttered his table. As he prepared the coffee, he was acutely aware of Sarah's presence in the space that had been his and Martha's private sanctuary. She moved with the kind of easy confidence that suggested she was comfortable in rural kitchens, probably from years of making house calls to farms throughout the county. "Mr. Brennan," Sarah said as they settled at the table with their coffee, "I've been doing some research since our conversation at the cafe, about my adoption, about the Thompson family's history in this area, about the timeline of when Clementine might have come to live with you." Harold kept his expression neutral, though his pulse was racing. "What kind of research?" Sarah opened her folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "I contacted the adoption agency that handled my case. They're still in business, though. They've changed names a couple of times. Most of the records are sealed, of course, but I was able to get some basic information about the circumstances of my adoption." She spread the papers across Harold's kitchen table, and he found himself staring at official letterheads and typed summaries that looked frighteningly similar to the documents he'd hidden in his desk drawer. According to the agency records, "I was born on March 12, 1989, to a young couple who were facing significant financial difficulties. The birth father was a farmer, and there were concerns about the family's ability to provide adequate care and support." March 12, 1989. Harold remembered that date with crystal clarity, the longest day of his life, filled with Carol's labor pains and his own emotional agony as they prepared to say goodbye to their child. "The interesting thing," Sarah continued, "is that the birth parents lived in this immediate area, rural farming community, probably within a few miles of where we're sitting right now." Harold's coffee cup rattled as he set it down, and he hoped Sarah hadn't noticed the tremor in his hands. "That is interesting. Mr. Brennan, I have to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm completely wrong." Sarah leaned forward, her green eyes intense with emotion. "I think you knew my biological parents. I think that's why you seemed so familiar to me, why our conversation felt so meaningful. There's something about you, your voice, your mannerisms, something I can't quite pinpoint, that feels like family." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Harold could feel the weight of 35 years of secrecy pressing down on him, demanding to be acknowledged. This was the moment he'd both dreaded and longed for since Sarah had walked into his life through Clementine's health scare. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what if I told you that your instincts were correct?" Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" Harold stood and walked to his desk in the adjacent room, returning with the manila envelope he'd examined so many times over the decades. With hands that shook despite his efforts to control them, he spread his own adoption papers across the table beside Sarah's agency documents. Sarah's eyes widened as she compared the dates, the legal descriptions, the administrative details that matched her own records exactly. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and something that might have been relief. She started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm your father," Harold said, his voice barely above. A whisper. "Carol was your mother. We were the young couple who couldn't provide for you." Sarah stared at the documents, then at Harold's face, as if trying to reconcile 35 years of wondering with the reality sitting across from her. "I can't believe it. I mean, I suspected something, but I thought maybe you were a family. A friend, or maybe you'd known my parents somehow. But you're actually—" "I'm the man who gave you away," Harold said, his voice heavy with decades of guilt and regret. I'm the father who chose your adoptive parents' financial stability over fighting to keep you." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of this revelation. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but emotional. "Tell me about my mother. Tell me about Carol." Harold felt tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. She was beautiful inside and out, smart, funny, devoted to the idea of family. She wanted children more than anything in the world, and when she found out she was pregnant with you, she was happier than I'd ever seen her. "What happened? Why did you—" Sarah gestured at the adoption papers. Harold took a shaky breath and began the story he'd never told anyone completely, about the farm's financial crisis, about the mounting debts and failed crops, about the impossible choice between keeping their daughter and ensuring she had a future. He told Sarah about Carol's devastation, about their hope that the Thompsons would provide the love and opportunities they couldn't offer. "Carol died 2 months after the adoption," Harold said, his voice breaking. "She was driving in an ice storm, probably going too fast because she was upset. The guilt about giving you up, about not being able to make our life work, it consumed her, and I've carried that guilt every day since." Sarah reached across the table and covered Harold's weathered hand with her own. "Mr. Brennan, Dad, you made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. From everything I can see in these papers, you were trying to do what was best for me." The word "Dad" hit Harold like a physical blow, and he found himself crying for the first time since Martha's funeral. 35 years of suppressed grief and regret poured out of him in ragged sobs that shook his shoulders and made speech impossible. Sarah moved her chair closer and put her arm around him, offering the kind of comfort that felt both foreign and perfectly natural. "It's okay," she murmured. "It's okay. I had a wonderful childhood. The Thompsons were amazing parents. You made the right choice." When Harold finally regained his composure, he looked at his daughter through tears and saw Carol's compassion reflected in her face. "I've thought about you every single day for 35 years. Wondered if you were happy, if you were healthy, if you ever thought about us." "I did think about you," Sarah said. "Both of you. I used to imagine what you looked like, what your voices sounded like, whether you ever regretted the decision. I never blamed you. My parents made sure I understood. That you gave me up out of love, not because you didn't want me." Harold pulled out the photograph of Carol holding Sarah as a newborn and slid it across the table. Sarah studied it with wonder, tracing her infant face and her mother's features with gentle fingers. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "I look like her. You have her eyes, her smile, her way of tilting your head when you're thinking. But you have something else. You became everything we hoped you'd become. You're kind, successful, devoted to helping others. Carol would be so proud." Sarah looked up from the photograph with tears in her own eyes. "And what about you? Are you proud?" Harold met his daughter's gaze, seeing in her face the answer to 35 years of prayers he'd never dared to voice. "I'm more proud than I have any right to be." They sat in Harold's kitchen as the afternoon light faded, sharing stories and filling in the gaps that had separated them for more than 3 decades. And through it all, Clementine remained nearby, as if she understood that her simple presence had somehow orchestrated this reunion that neither of them had dared to hope. For the days following Harold's revelation to Sarah passed in a strange, suspended state of emotional intensity. Sarah had taken time off from her veterinary practice to process the life-altering discovery that the farmer who'd brought in a stray cat was actually the father she'd wondered about her entire life. Harold found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routines, alternating between euphoria at having found his daughter and terror that he'd somehow damaged her life by revealing the truth. They'd agreed to meet again in a few days, giving both of them time to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. But Harold couldn't stop thinking about the practical implications of their situation. Sarah had a life, relationships, a professional reputation in the community, How would their newfound connection affect all of that? And then there was Rebecca, who still had no idea that her understanding of their family was about to change forever. It was while Harold was searching through Martha's belongings for something to distract himself that he made a discovery that stopped him cold. Hidden in the back of Martha's jewelry box, beneath layers of costume pearls and the simple gold earrings she'd worn to church, was a small leather diary he'd never seen before. The diary was slim, bound in soft brown leather that had darkened with age. Martha's name was embossed on the cover in fading gold letters, and the pages inside were filled with her careful handwriting. Harold hesitated before opening it, aware that reading his deceased wife's private thoughts might reveal things he wasn't prepared to know. But curiosity and a growing sense of unease compelled him to begin reading. The entries were dated, starting from shortly after their wedding and continuing sporadically through the years of their marriage. Most were mundane observations, notes about garden plans, concerns about Harold's health, reflections on their inability to have children. But as Harold read deeper into the diary, he found entries that made his heart race with a mixture of guilt and amazement. June 15th, 1995. Harold had another nightmare last night. He was calling out a name, Carol, and something about a baby. When I asked him about it this morning, he said he couldn't remember dreaming at all. But his eyes had that distant look they get sometimes, like he's seeing something I can't. October 3rd, 1998. We drove past the adoption agency in town today, and Harold got so quiet, I thought something was wrong with the truck. When I asked, he just said he was thinking about all the children who need homes. Sometimes I wonder if there's something in his past he hasn't told me about. February 14th, 2001. Harold keeps that manila envelope in his desk drawer, the one he thinks I don't know about. I've never looked inside, but sometimes late at night I see him sitting at that desk, just staring at it. We've been married 12 years, and there are still parts of him that feel like locked rooms. May 22nd, 2005. I saw Harold talking to Clementine this morning, and I swear he was apologizing for something. He said, "I'm sorry I couldn't keep you together." I don't know what he meant, but it broke my heart to see him in such pain. Harold's hands shook as he read his wife's careful documentation of his unconscious grief, her patient observation of the secrets he thought he'd successfully hidden. Martha had known, perhaps not the specific details, but she'd sensed the presence of some profound loss in his life. The most devastating entry was near the end of the diary, dated just months before Martha's cancer diagnosis, January 8th, 2014. I know Harold gave up a child before we met. I've known for years, though I've never confronted him about it. The signs are all there. His reaction to babies, his nightmares about someone named Carol, the way he sometimes looks at families with young children. I think it was a daughter, and I think losing her nearly destroyed him. I wish he trusted me enough to share this burden, but I understand why he hasn't. Some grief is too deep for words. I just hope someday he finds peace with whatever happened. Harold closed the diary and sat in stunned silence. Martha had known. Through all their years of marriage, through all his careful concealment and protective silence, she'd recognized the shape of his secret and loved him anyway. She'd understood that his reticence came from pain, not lack of trust, and she'd chosen to give him the space to heal rather than demanding explanations that might have caused more damage. The discovery of Martha's diary changed everything Harold thought he understood about his marriage. He'd spent years feeling guilty about keeping the adoption secret from her, worried that his deception had somehow diminished their relationship. Now he realized that Martha's love had been strong enough to encompass even the parts of himself he couldn't share. That evening, Harold called Rebecca. "I need to see you," he said without preamble. "There's something important we need to discuss." Rebecca arrived within the hour, her expression concerned. She found Harold sitting at his kitchen table with Martha's diary, the adoption papers, and the photograph of Carol and the baby spread before him, like evidence in a case he was finally ready to present. "Dad, what's all this?" Harold gestured for her to sit down. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something about my first marriage, something I should have told you years ago." He watched his daughter's face as he explained about Carol, about the financial desperation that had led to placing their daughter for adoption, about the 35 years of guilt and wondering that had followed. Rebecca listened without interruption, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like hurt. "You had another daughter?" she said when Harold finished. "I have a sister, a half-sister. Her name is Sarah, and she's—" Harold paused, realizing how complicated this was about to become. "She's Dr. Mitchell, the veterinarian who examined Clementine." Rebecca's eyes widened. "The woman from the clinic. She's—" "How did you find out?" Harold explained about the microchip, about the Thompson connection, about Sarah's own research into her adoption that had led to their mutual recognition. As he spoke, he watched Rebecca process not just the existence of a sister she'd never known about, but the fact that this sister had been living in their community, treating their animals, existing in their orbit without any of them realizing. "The connection. I can't believe this," Rebecca said finally. "All these years, you never said anything. Mom never knew." Harold slid Martha's diary across the table. She knew something. "Read this." Rebecca read selected passages from the diary, her expression growing more complex with each entry. When she finished, she looked at Harold with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "She was protecting you," Rebecca said. "She could have confronted you, demanded to know the truth, but she chose to let you work through it in your own time." "I was trying to protect everyone," Harold said. "You, Martha, even Sarah. I thought keeping this secret was the kindest thing to do. And now I don't know what's kind anymore. Sarah knows the truth, and she seems to want some kind of relationship with me. But what about her life, her adoptive parents? What about you and your children? What about our family's reputation? In this community?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph of Carol and the baby. "Dad, do you see any resemblance?" Harold looked at the picture, then at Rebecca. "Between Sarah and you? Between Sarah and Mom?" "Martha, I mean, the shape of her face, the way she smiles. I noticed it when I met her at the clinic, but I thought it was just one of those random similarities you sometimes see." Harold studied the photograph more carefully, and with a shock, he realized Rebecca was right. Sarah bore a resemblance not just to Carol, but to Martha as well. Something about the gentle expression, the intelligent eyes, the way she held herself. "It's like," Rebecca continued slowly, "like maybe this was supposed to happen. Maybe Martha somehow knew that bringing Clementine into our lives would eventually lead to finding Sarah. Maybe this isn't about disruption or secrets coming to light. Maybe it's about healing." Harold felt tears burning his eyes again. "Do you think Martha would have wanted this?" Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed her father's hand. "Dad, read that diary again. Martha wanted you to find peace with whatever happened in your past. Finding Sarah isn't betraying Martha's memory, it's honoring her wish for your happiness." That night, Harold sat on his front porch with Clementine. On his lap, looking up at the star-filled Nebraska sky and thinking about the impossible chain of events that had brought his family back together. A stray cat with a microchip, a daughter who became a veterinarian, a wife whose love had been deep enough to encompass secrets she never demanded to know. Tomorrow, he would call Sarah and ask if she wanted to meet Rebecca. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate work of building relationships that spanned decades of separation. Tomorrow they would discover whether the love that had prompted his original sacrifice was strong enough to create something new and healing from the fragments of what had been lost. But tonight, Harold simply sat in grateful amazement at the mysterious ways life could circle back on itself, bringing second chances to those who had long since stopped believing they deserved them. 2 days later, Sarah returned to Harold's farm, carrying a small white envelope and wearing an expression that mixed nervousness with determined hope. Harold had called her the previous evening, explaining that Rebecca now knew about her existence and was eager to meet her half-sister. The idea of expanding their newly discovered relationship to include Harold's other family felt both exciting and terrifying. "I brought something," Sarah said as they settled on Harold's front porch with glasses of iced tea. "After our last conversation, I went to see my parents in Florida. I told them about finding you, about learning the truth." Harold's stomach clenched with worry. How did they react? Sarah smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her since their revelation. "They were wonderful. Dad cried, actually. He said they'd always hoped that someday I might have the chance to meet my biological father, but they'd never wanted to interfere with whatever decision you'd made about contact." She opened the white envelope and pulled out a folded document. "They wanted you to have this. It's a letter they wrote to you and my biological mother right after the adoption, but they never knew how to get it to you through the agency." Harold accepted the letter with trembling hands. The envelope was addressed simply to Sarah's birth parents in Margaret Thompson's careful cursive. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, dated March 1989. "Dear Sarah's birth parents, we know we will probably never have the opportunity to give you this letter, but we wanted to write it anyway in case someday our paths might cross. We cannot. Begin to express our gratitude for the incredible gift you have given us. Richard and I have wanted a child for so many years, and when the agency told us about Sarah, we felt like our prayers had been answered. But we also understand that your prayers have been answered in a different way, through the sacrifice you made to ensure Sarah would have every opportunity for happiness and success. We want you to know that we will love her as if she were born to us. We will tell her about you with respect and appreciation, never letting her forget that she was wanted and loved by 4 parents instead of just 2. We will make sure she knows that your decision came from love, not from lack of caring. If there ever comes a time when you would like to know how Sarah is doing, please know that you would be welcome in our lives. We consider ourselves the guardians of your daughter, not her replacement parents. The love you gave her in those first 3 days will always be part of who she is. With deepest gratitude and respect, Richard and Margaret Thompson Harold read the letter twice, tears blurring his vision. The Thompsons had understood, even 35 years ago, that adoption was not an ending but a transformation, a way of extending love rather than replacing it. "They really were perfect parents," Sarah said softly. "Everything they promised in that letter, they delivered on. I never felt like I was missing anything, but I also never forgot that there were other people in the world who had loved me first." Before Harold could respond, Rebecca's car appeared on the gravel drive. Sarah straightened with visible nervousness as Harold's other daughter approached the porch. "Sarah," Harold said, standing as Rebecca climbed the porch steps, "I'd like you to meet Rebecca. Rebecca, this is Sarah." The 2 women looked at each other with the curious intensity of people searching for family resemblances and shared traits. Rebecca was older by nearly a decade, her professional demeanor contrasting with Sarah's more casual veterinary attire, but Harold could see similarities in the way they both tilted their heads slightly when thinking, the way they both had inherited. Carol's expressive hands. "I can't believe this is happening," Rebecca said finally. "I can't believe I have a sister I never knew about." "It's strange for me, too," Sarah replied. "I grew up as an only child, always wondering what it would be like to have siblings." They shook hands, the gesture formal but not unfriendly, then stood in the kind of awkward silence that accompanies momentous occasions for which there are no established social protocols. Harold realized that this moment, watching his 2 daughters meet for the first time, was something he'd never dared to imagine. In all his years of wondering about Sarah, of hoping she was happy and healthy, he'd never considered the possibility that his two families might someday merge. "Sarah's a veterinarian," Harold said, attempting to bridge the silence. "She's the one who discovered Clementine's microchip," Rebecca smiled. "The whole family owes you a debt of gratitude for taking such good care of Clementine, and for taking such good care of Dad, whether you knew who he was or not." Sarah glanced at Harold, then back at Rebecca. "He's a good man. I could tell that from the first time he brought Clementine into the clinic. There was something about the way he cared for her that spoke to who he is as a person." "That's Dad," Rebecca said, her voice carrying both affection and the slight exasperation that comes from knowing someone's stubbornness as well as their kindness. "He's been taking in strays, animals and people, his whole life." Harold felt a warmth spread through his chest as he listened to his daughters talk about him. For so many years, he defined himself primarily through his regrets and failures. But hearing Sarah and Rebecca discuss his character, he began to see himself through their eyes, not as the man who'd given up his daughter, but as the man who'd provided love and care to whoever needed it, including the cat who'd somehow brought them all back together. Clementine chose that moment to appear, emerging from her afternoon nap to investigate the voices on the porch. She approached Sarah with the confidence of recognition, rubbing against her legs with a purr that was audible from several feet away. Sarah bent to scratch Clementine's ears. "Hello, old friend. Look what you've accomplished." As the afternoon progressed, the initial awkwardness between Sarah and Rebecca began to dissolve into something more natural. They discovered shared interests. Both were devoted to their communities. Both had inherited what Rebecca called Dad's stubborn streak. And both possessed the kind of practical problem-solving skills that came from growing up connected to rural life. Sarah shared stories about her veterinary training and her decision to return to Nebraska after completing her residency in Colorado. Rebecca talked about her family, her work in insurance, and the challenges of caring for an aging father who insisted on maintaining his independence. Harold listened to their conversation with the surreal pleasure of watching two parts of his life integrate in ways he'd never imagined possible. "Sarah," Rebecca said during a lull in conversation, "can I ask you something that might be too personal?" "Of course. Are you angry? About the adoption, I mean. About Dad giving you up?" Sarah considered the question carefully, glancing at Harold before responding. "I was at first. When I realized who he was, there was definitely anger mixed in with all the other emotions. But the more I think about it, the more I understand that he made the only choice he could make, given the circumstances." She turned to Harold. "I've been thinking about what you told me about Mom, about Carol, about the financial situation you were facing, and I keep coming back to the fact that you chose parents who could give me everything you couldn't. That's not abandonment, that's sacrifice." Harold felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped wondering if you were happy, if you needed anything, if you ever thought about us. I did think about you, both of you, but I also had a wonderful childhood with parents who loved me completely. The Thompsons never made me feel like I was a consolation prize or a second choice. They made me feel chosen." Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Speaking of chosen, there's someone else who should know about this." She looked at Harold and Sarah. "My kids, your grandchildren," she said to Harold, then added to Sarah, "and your niece and nephew." The idea of grandchildren meeting their previously unknown aunt, of Sarah suddenly acquiring a new generation of family members, added another layer of complexity to their situation. But as Rebecca scrolled through photos on her phone, Harold felt a sense of rightness about expanding their circle of connection. "This is Emma. She's 15, and this is Jake. He's 13, Rebecca said, showing Sarah pictures of her children. "They're going to be fascinated by this whole story." Sarah studied the photos with genuine interest. "They're beautiful. Do they know about me yet?" "Not yet. I wanted to meet you first, make sure this was real and not just some elaborate coincidence." Rebecca paused. "But if you're willing, I'd love for them to meet their aunt." The word aunt seemed to surprise Sarah, and Harold watched her face as she processed this new identity. She'd gone from being an only child to discovering she had a father and a half-sister, and now she was being offered a role in the lives of the next generation. "I'd like that very much," Sarah said softly. Rebecca stood up and moved to the porch, railing, positioning Harold and Sarah side by side on the porch swing, with Clementine settled between them. "Let me get a picture of this moment," she said, raising her phone. "The first official photo of our expanded family." As Rebecca framed the shot, Harold felt the weight of history settling around them. This simple photograph would mark the end of 35 years of separation and the beginning of whatever relationships they might build together. It would be proof that sometimes the most devastating losses could transform into unexpected gifts. "Say cheese," Rebecca called out, then stopped herself. "Actually, no, just be yourselves. This moment is too important for artificial smiles." Harold looked at Sarah, seeing Carol's features softened by decades of love from the Thompsons, shaped by her own experiences and choices. Sarah looked back at him, and in that moment, Harold felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening of grief he'd carried for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight. The camera clicked, capturing the three of them in a moment of genuine connection. Clementine, as if sensing the significance of the occasion, looked directly at the camera with the serene expression of a cat who had accomplished something important. "Perfect," Rebecca said, looking at the image on her phone. "This is going to be a family treasure." Harold thought about all the photographs he'd treasured over the years, the picture of Carol holding newborn Sarah, the wedding photos with Martha, the various snapshots of Rebecca growing up. This new photograph would join that collection, representing not an ending, but a beginning, not a restoration of what had been lost, but a creation of something entirely new. As the sun began to set over the Nebraska farmland, casting long shadows, across the porch, where Harold's two daughters sat, talking about their lives, their shared father, and their uncertain but hopeful future together, Harold felt a peace he hadn't experienced since those brief 3 days in 1989, when he'd held his newborn daughter and believed, however briefly, that love might be enough to solve any problem. Perhaps after all these years, it finally was. 3 months after that first family photograph, Harold's life had settled into a rhythm he could never have imagined. The small notebook he kept on his kitchen counter, where he'd always listed his daily tasks in careful handwriting, now included entries that would have seemed impossible just a few seasons earlier. Call Sarah, 2 p.m., family dinner prep, pick up photos from Emma's recital. The notebook itself had become a symbol of how thoroughly his world had expanded. What had once been a simple record of farm chores and appointments now documented a life rich with family connections and shared experiences. Harold had always been a man of routines, but these new routines brought joy instead of mere structure. Sarah had established a pattern of monthly checkups for Clementine, appointments that had nothing to do with medical necessity and everything to do with maintaining the connection that had brought them together. These visits had evolved into lengthy conversations about veterinary practice, farming, family history, and the gradual process of building a relationship across decades of separation. During one such visit in late November, Harold had finally worked up the courage to show Sarah the complete contents of his manila envelope. Not just the adoption papers, but every document, every photograph, every scrap of memory he'd preserved from her earliest days. Sarah had studied each item with the careful attention of someone reconstructing a lost piece of herself, asking gentle questions about Carol, about their brief time as a family, about the love that had motivated such a difficult decision. "I understand now why you kept all of this," Sarah had said, holding the tiny hospital bracelet that had once encircled her newborn wrist. "You weren't trying to hold on to guilt. You were trying to hold on to love." The integration of Sarah into Harold's existing family had proceeded more smoothly than anyone had dared hope. Rebecca's children, initially stunned by the news that they had an aunt they'd never known about, had embraced Sarah with the easy acceptance that young people often bring to unexpected situations. Emma, Harold's 15-year-old granddaughter, had been particularly fascinated by Sarah's veterinary career and had begun talking about following a similar path. The monthly family dinners that now took place at Harold's farmhouse had become occasions that Martha would have loved. Sarah proved to be an accomplished cook, having learned from Margaret Thompson the same attention to nurturing through food that Martha had practiced. Rebecca contributed her organizational skills, coordinating schedules and ensuring that everyone felt included. Harold provided the setting and the stories, sharing memories of 4 generations of Brennan family history that Sarah had never heard. These dinners took place around the same kitchen table where Harold had once sat alone with only Clementine for company. Now the table extended with folding chairs to accommodate Sarah, Rebecca and her family, and occasionally the Thompsons when they visited from Florida. The conversations ranged from Emma's school activities to Jake's baseball season to Sarah's most challenging veterinary cases to Rebecca's work projects. Harold had worried initially that Richard and Margaret Thompson might feel displaced or threatened by his re-entry into Sarah's life, but their first meeting had dispelled those concerns completely. The Thompsons had welcomed Harold with warmth and gratitude, acknowledging that their family had always been incomplete without some connection to Sarah's biological heritage. "We've been parents," Margaret had told Harold during that first emotional meeting, "but we've always known we were caretakers of someone else's daughter too. Having you in Sarah's life doesn't diminish our relationship with her. It completes it." The extended family now included regular communication between Harold's farm and the Thompsons' retirement community in Florida. Richard had even offered advice about crop rotation techniques he'd learned during his own farming years, creating an unlikely bond between the man who had raised Harold's daughter and the man who had given her life. Clementine, the unwitting architect of this reunion, had adapted to her elevated status within the family hierarchy with typical feline dignity. She seemed to understand that she was now a cherished figure in multiple households, accepting attention and treats from her expanded circle of humans while maintaining her primary loyalty to Harold. On this particular December evening, as Harold sat on his front porch with Clementine on his lap, he could see Sarah's truck approaching through the early winter twilight. She'd called earlier to say she was bringing soup and fresh bread, concerned that Harold might not be eating enough during the cold snap that had settled over Nebraska. As Sarah climbed the porch steps carrying a covered pot that smelled like heaven, Harold reflected on the mysterious ways life could circle back on itself. The same financial pressures that had once forced him to give up his daughter had taught him the value of simplicity and self-sufficiency. The same grief that had nearly destroyed him had also taught him to treasure small moments of connection and comfort. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" Sarah asked, setting down the pot and settling into the chair beside his porch swing. The word Dad still had the power to move him, even after months of hearing it regularly. Harold had worried that 35 years of separation had made the title meaningless, but Sarah used it with the same natural affection she'd once reserved for Richard Thompson. Both men were her father, each in his own essential way. "I'm feeling grateful," Harold answered honestly. "Grateful for second chances, grateful for family, grateful for cats who carry microchips that lead to miracles." Sarah laughed, reaching over to scratch Clementine behind the ears. Who would have thought that a little lump on a cat's side could change so many lives? Harold looked out over his farmland, now covered with the first light snow of winter, and thought about all the things that had seemed like problems but had turned out to be blessings in disguise. Clementine's mysterious lump, Sarah's curiosity about her biological parents, even his own stubborn pride that had initially resisted bringing Clementine to the veterinarian. "Sometimes," Harold said, watching his daughter's face in the warm light, spilling from his kitchen windows. The things we're most afraid of turn out to be exactly what we need most. As they sat together in the peaceful evening, planning the week's activities and sharing the comfortable silence that comes with family, Harold felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to see his greatest regret transformed into his most precious gift. Clementine purred contentedly on his lap, and Harold smiled, knowing that some stories have endings that are really beginnings, and some losses lead to discoveries that are worth a lifetime of waiting.